The wind howled through the jagged peaks, carrying the scent of scorched metal and the distant echoes of war. Lieutenant Adrian Graves lay motionless on the icy rock, his body camouflaged against the harsh terrain. Through his scope, he watched the alien figures moving in the valley below, hundreds of them, advancing in a relentless tide. The Kvarn. They were methodical, like a single organism inching its way forward, driven by a hive-mind intelligence that made them nearly unstoppable. Winds picked up, southeast at 3 clicks. Sergeant Lena Kova murmured, her voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. Her eyes never left the digital readouts on her tablet, monitoring the atmospheric conditions and enemy movements. You're going to need to adjust elevation by a 1/4 mil. Adrian's fingers moved almost instinctively, making the minute adjustments to his rifle. The stock was cold against his cheek, but he ignored it, his focus razor-sharp. He tracked a Kvarn commander through the scope, watching the creature's segmented armor plates shifting as it barked orders to its subordinates. Adrian's breath slowed, his heartbeat steadying into the familiar rhythm he trained for years to master. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Lena asked quietly. "Command's orders were clear. Fall back and regroup at Alpha Point." "Fall back means death," Adrian replied, his voice a low growl. He lined up his shot, calculating the wind speed, the distance, the slight rotation of the planet beneath them. Everything was against him. The Kvarn armor was nearly impervious to energy weapons, and even the best Terran snipers had struggled to punch through it. But he wasn't using energy rounds. He was betting his life on something old, something everyone else had written off as obsolete, a solid tungsten round. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder with a familiar, satisfying recoil. The bullet sliced through the frigid air, its supersonic crack echoing off the mountains. For a split second, it seemed like nothing had happened. Then, the Kvarn commander's head snapped back, a jagged hole appearing just below the ridge of its exoskeleton helmet. The creature crumpled, its limbs spasming as the hive-mind connection severed. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Confirmed kill. Nice shot." But Adrian wasn't celebrating. Through his scope, he watched the chaos rippling through the Kvarn ranks. The hive mind was struggling to compensate, the loss of a key node sending a shudder through the collective. Soldiers hesitated, their previously perfect formations breaking as confusion spread. It wouldn't last long, but it was a window, one they desperately needed. "Relay to command," he said, his voice still tight with concentration. "We've neutralized an enemy command unit. Request immediate artillery strike on coordinates." A shrill, chittering sound cut him off. Adrian's blood ran cold. He shifted his scope slightly, focusing on a new group of Kvarn moving up the ridge. These were different, larger, their armor thicker and lined with strange, pulsing nodes that shimmered in the pale light. He'd never seen this type before. "Lena, are you seeing this?" She adjusted her scope, her expression tightening. "Advanced units. Camouflage, maybe? I'm getting weird readings on their energy output." "Damn it," Adrian muttered. His mind raced, considering their options. These new units were moving with purpose, converging on their position. The Kvarn had adapted, deploying specialized soldiers to hunt them down. "We need to move," Lena said, urgency creeping into her voice. "If they get within 50 meters. "They won't," Adrian interrupted. He adjusted his scope again, his eyes narrowing. He needed to see, to understand what they were dealing with. As he watched, one of the creatures shimmered, its outline blurring before it vanished completely. It was as if it had melted into the landscape, becoming one with the rocks and snow. "Shit," Lena breathed. "Optical cloaking." Adrian's jaw clenched. "They're evolving. Fast." He scanned the area, trying to spot the invisible predators. A faint glimmer, a distortion in the air, he fired. The shot went wide, striking a boulder and sending up a spray of shattered rock. "Miss," Lena said tersely. "You're not going to be able to hit what you can't see, sir. We have to move." "Now." Adrian hesitated. Every instinct told him to retreat, to regroup and find a new vantage point. But he couldn't shake the feeling that running would only delay the inevitable. The Ktharn were relentless. Once they had your scent, they didn't stop. Wait, he said suddenly, holding up a hand. He tilted his head, listening. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind and distant gunfire, but there, a rhythmic clicking, barely audible, coming from somewhere nearby. What is it? Lena asked, her voice taut. Listen, Adrian whispered. He closed his eyes, blocking out everything else, focusing on the sound. Click, click, click. It was mechanical, unnatural, and it was getting closer. They're using cloaking, but they can't hide everything. He murmured, more to himself than to Lena. They still need to breathe. Understanding dawned in Lena's eyes. You're going to use sound to target them? Only chance we've got. He shifted his aim, tracking the source of the clicking. He couldn't see his target, but he could feel it, sense it moving closer, circling like a predator. His finger tightened on the trigger. A sudden blur of motion, a Ktharn soldier appeared, materializing out of thin air less than 20 meters away, its claws outstretched. Adrian fired, the bullet catching the creature just as it lunged. It shrieked, its camouflage shorting out as it crumpled to the ground, dead before it hit the rocks. But there were more, dozens more, and they were closing in fast. We're out of time, Lena shouted, grabbing Adrian's arm. We need to fall back, regroup with the others. Adrian nodded, his mind still racing. The Ktharn had sent these specialized units to take them out, and now the rest of the swarm was regrouping. If they didn't move, they'd be overwhelmed in minutes. He scrambled to his feet, his legs stiff from hours of lying still. Go, go! He barked, shoving Lena ahead of him as they sprinted across the ridge. Behind them, the air shimmered and rippled as more camouflaged Ktharn appeared, their clicking growing louder, echoing in the narrow canyon. Adrian glanced over his shoulder, his heart hammering. They were almost out of range, almost. A massive Ktharn leaped from the rocks above, its claws scything through the air. Adrian threw himself to the side, the creature's strike narrowly missing him. He hit the ground hard, his rifle skittering away. The Ktharn loomed over him, its mandibles snapping, eyes gleaming with cold, alien intelligence. Adrian reached for his sidearm, his movements sluggish, his mind screaming that it was too late. A sharp crack rang out, and the Ktharn's head jerked back, a bullet hole appearing between its eyes. Lena stood a few meters away, her pistol smoking. Get up, sir, she said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. This isn't over. Adrian staggered to his feet, grabbing his rifle. He could see the rest of the Ktharn forces regrouping, the shimmering outlines of more camouflaged soldiers moving in. They were surrounded, cut off from any chance of escape. And then, from the ridge above, came a new sound, the heavy, rhythmic thump of approaching gunships. The roar of the gunships filled the air, drowning out the clicking advance of the Ktharn soldiers. Adrian's shot echoed through the canyon, the bullet tearing through the shimmering outline of a cloaked alien, dropping it instantly. But there was no time to savor the victory. He hauled Lena to her feet, his voice urgent. Move! We've got a window, but it won't last. They sprinted across the rocky terrain, the ground vibrating beneath their feet as the gunships swooped in overhead, unleashing a torrent of fire on the Ktharn below. Explosions lit up the night, turning the barren landscape into a hellscape of smoke and flame. Adrian's lungs burned with every breath, but he didn't slow down. They needed to reach the extraction point before the Ktharn adapted again. Contact 9 o'clock! Lena shouted, raising her rifle. Adrian pivoted, catching sight of a trio of Ktharn soldiers emerging from the smoke, their camouflaged forms flickering as they shifted in and out of visibility. Lena fired, her bullet striking one in the chest, but the other two continued their advance. Adrian dropped to one knee, lining up his shot. He squeezed the trigger, the round catching the lead Ktharn in the eye socket, its head snapping back with a spray of viscous green fluid. The remaining soldier hesitated, and in that split second, Lena fired again, dropping it with a precise shot to the throat. Clear, she said, her voice breathless but steady. She glanced at Adrian, her eyes wide with adrenaline and fear. How many more do you think? Too many, he replied grimly. He could see more shapes moving through the smoke, closing in from all sides. The gunships had given them a brief respite, but the Ktharn were relentless. They wouldn't stop until they were dead. They continued running, their boots crunching over the loose gravel, dodging around jagged rocks and debris. The extraction point was just ahead, marked by the faint green glow of a signal beacon. Adrian could see a squad of Terran Marines setting up a defensive perimeter, their weapons trained outward. Relief surged through him. If they could reach the Marines, they might just make it out alive. But then, a massive shape loomed out of the smoke, towering over the Marines. It was a Ktharn behemoth, its chitinous armor glistening in the firelight, a living tank that shrugged off the Marines' energy blasts as if they were nothing. The creature roared, swinging a massive claw, sending soldiers flying. Damn it! Adrian muttered, skidding to a halt. We're not going to make it through that. Lena's face was pale, but her voice was steady. We have to try. We can't hold out here. Adrian's mind raced. They were trapped between the Ktharn forces converging from behind and the behemoth blocking their only escape route. He glanced around, his eyes landing on a narrow crevice in the rocks to their right. There, he said, pointing. We cut through that ravine, flank around. It's a gamble, but it's better than charging straight into that thing. Lena nodded, no hesitation. Let's go. They darted into the ravine, the walls rising steeply on either side, narrowing until they were forced to move single file. The sounds of battle faded slightly, the towering rock formations muffling the chaos outside. Adrian led the way, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. This place feels like a trap, Lena muttered, her voice echoing off the stone. Perfect for an ambush. Adrian knew she was right. The tight confines left them vulnerable, with no room to maneuver if they were attacked. But they had no choice. The behemoth would tear them apart in the open, and staying put was a death sentence. They moved cautiously, every step deliberate and quiet. The ravine twisted and turned, the path ahead obscured by shadows. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest, his senses on high alert. The air was cold, biting at his exposed skin, and the silence was oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He froze, raising a hand to signal Lena. She stopped immediately, her rifle coming up, eyes scanning the darkness. What is it? She whispered. Adrian didn't answer, his gaze locked on the narrow ledge above them. He could just make out a faint shimmer, like a heatwave, rippling against the rock. His stomach tightened. They're here, he breathed. Above us. He moved slowly, keeping his eyes on the ledge, trying to track the invisible forms shifting overhead. He could hear the faint clicking of their breathers, the sound barely audible over the blood rushing in his ears. There were at least 3, maybe more. Too many to take out without being seen. We need to backtrack, Lena whispered. Find another way. A sharp clatter cut her off as a rock tumbled from the ledge, dislodged by an unseen foot. The sound was deafening in the stillness. Adrian's heart skipped a beat. Go! He shouted, shoving Lena forward. A burst of gunfire erupted from above, the bullets ricocheting off the walls, sparks flying. Adrian fired blindly up at the ledge, hearing a satisfying shriek as one of his shots connected. But there was no time to confirm the kill. They sprinted down the ravine, the path narrowing even further. Adrian's mind raced. They couldn't keep running blind like this. They needed to find a defensible position, somewhere to make a stand. His eyes scanned the walls, looking for any kind of cover. There! Lena pointed to a small alcove in the rock face, barely large enough to fit them both. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They dove inside, pressing themselves against the cold stone, their breathing harsh and ragged. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the ravine. Adrian peeked around the corner, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could see the shadows of the Ktharn soldiers moving down the path, their cloaked forms blending seamlessly with the rocks. He counted 4, maybe 5. Too many. Lena's hand tightened on his arm. We can't take them all. Adrian knew she was right. But they couldn't stay hidden forever. He took a deep breath, his mind racing through their dwindling options. They needed a distraction, something to draw the K'tharn away. Then, an idea struck him. It was reckless, borderline suicidal, but it was the only chance they had. "Stay here," he whispered, reaching into his pack and pulling out a small, cylindrical device, a high-frequency disruptor, designed to scramble K'tharn communications. He set the timer for 30 seconds and handed it to Lena. "When this goes off, run like hell. I'll cover you." Her eyes widened. "Adrian, you can't." "I can." He cut her off, his voice firm. "You get out of here. Find the others. I'll catch up." She hesitated, her expression torn between fear and resolve. "You better." He nodded, his gaze softening for just a moment. "Go." Lena took the disruptor, her jaw set. Then, with one last look, she darted out of the alcove, disappearing into the shadows. Adrian watched her go, his heart clenching. Then he turned back to the ravine, raising his rifle, his eyes narrowing as the K'tharn approached. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He needed to buy her time. Just a few seconds. The first K'tharn rounded the corner, its form shimmering as it deactivated its cloak, mandibles clicking in a low, menacing rhythm. Adrian aimed, his finger tightening on the trigger. The air vibrated with a low, guttural growl as the behemoth's enormous bulk shifted in the narrow ravine. Its massive claws scraped against the rock walls, sending a rain of debris cascading down. Adrian's grip tightened on his rifle, sweat trickling down his face despite the freezing cold. There was no way around it, no room to maneuver. The K'tharn soldiers he had been prepared to fight now seemed almost insignificant compared to the monstrous creature blocking his path. Adrian's mind raced. This wasn't just a brute force move. The K'tharn were adapting faster than he'd anticipated. They weren't just here to kill him, they wanted to break him, to crush the spirit of the Phantom, who had started to inspire hope among the human forces. He felt the weight of that expectation pressing down on him, but there was no time to dwell on it. Survival, then strategy. He took a deep breath, his eyes darting around the ravine. The walls were jagged but slick with ice, impossible to scale. The behemoth's massive form blocked the only visible exit, its eyes glinting with a predatory intelligence that sent a chill down his spine. Adrian knew he needed to think, and fast. A sound echoed from behind, Lena's disruptor going off. The high-frequency blast reverberated through the narrow canyon, sending a ripple of confusion through the K'tharn soldiers. The behemoth flinched, its head turning towards the source of the noise. Adrian seized the moment, aiming for the exposed joint beneath its armored neck. He fired, the bullet striking true, but it barely scratched the thick chitin. The creature roared, a deafening sound that shook the ground beneath him. Adrian gritted his teeth, feeling the shockwave rattle his bones. He needed a new plan, and he needed it now. Then, through the chaos, an idea took root, crazy, desperate, but it was all he had. He reached into his pack, pulling out the last of his explosives. It wasn't much, just a shaped charge meant for blowing through doors or light cover, but it might be enough. He just needed to get close. Heart pounding, he moved quickly, darting forward and hugging the wall of the ravine. The behemoth's attention was still focused on the disruptor's lingering echoes, its massive head swiveling as it searched for the source. Adrian kept low, his boots slipping on the icy ground as he crept closer. 10 meters. He could feel the heat radiating off the creature, the sickly sweet smell of its breath filling the air. The behemoth's claws scraped against the rock again, a massive limb shifting dangerously close to where Adrian crouched. One swipe, and it would be over. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm. He had one shot at this. If he failed, Lena was as good as dead, and the Terran forces would lose one of their few remaining chances to turn the tide. 5 meters. He could see the vulnerable gap beneath its massive shoulder plate, a weak point where the armor didn't quite meet. He set the charge, his fingers numb from the cold and the adrenaline. The behemoth let out another low growl, its head snapping around as if it sensed him. Adrian froze, every muscle tense, waiting for the killing blow. But the creature hesitated, its eyes flickering as if confused. The disruptor's lingering effect, maybe, or just blind luck. Adrian didn't wait to find out. He activated the timer on the charge and rolled it towards the behemoth's feet, then scrambled back, his heart in his throat. The behemoth's gaze snapped to the small device at its feet. It let out a roar, raising one massive claw to swipe at it. The explosion rocked the ravine, a deafening blast that sent shards of rock and chitin flying. Adrian was thrown back, his ears ringing, the world spinning around him. He hit the ground hard, his vision blurring as he struggled to breathe. For a moment he thought he'd failed, that the behemoth would be standing there, enraged but unscathed. But as the smoke cleared, he saw the massive form topple, its head lolling to one side, the chitinous plates cracked and smoking where the charge had blown through. The behemoth let out one final, shuddering breath, then collapsed, its bulk blocking the ravine completely. Adrian lay still, his chest heaving, every muscle screaming in protest. He forced himself to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his side. The behemoth's body was a twisted ruin, but it had done its job, it had sealed off the only exit. For a long moment, he just stared, his mind struggling to process what had happened. He was trapped. The ravine was a dead end now, and there was no way over or around the massive corpse. His hands tightened into fists, frustration boiling over. But he couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. Lena was still out there, and if he was trapped, so was she. He needed to find another way, some path that would get him back to her. His mind raced, sifting through options. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, and turned back the way he had come. There had to be something, a crack in the rock, an overlooked crevice, anything that might offer a way out. He retraced his steps, scanning every inch of the ravine walls, but they were solid, unyielding. His frustration grew with every step, every fruitless search. He could still hear the faint echoes of gunfire from outside, the distant rumble of explosions. The battle was raging on, and here he was, stuck in a damn trap with no way to help. Then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned sharply, his rifle coming up, but it was no enemy. A small, glowing device was embedded in the rock, just visible beneath a layer of dust and grime. He frowned, stepping closer. It was a beacon, old and damaged but still functional. Adrian's heart skipped a beat. This was no Klarn tech. It was human, probably from an old scouting mission. He knelt, wiping away the dirt to reveal a cracked screen. The beacon's display flickered to life, showing a schematic of the surrounding area. A thin line indicated a tunnel, narrow and winding, but leading out of the ravine to the east. Hope surged through him. It wasn't much, but it was a way out. He didn't waste time. Slinging his rifle over his shoulder, he moved quickly, following the beacon's map. The entrance to the tunnel was almost invisible, a narrow crack in the rock barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, then pushed inside. The darkness closed in around him, the air cold and stale. He moved carefully, his hands brushing against the rough stone, his senses alert. Every step felt like an eternity, but he pressed on, the faint light of the beacon guiding him forward. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the narrow passage twisting and turning, but finally, he saw a faint light ahead. Relief washed over him as he pushed through the last few meters, emerging into a small clearing, the sky open above him. He stumbled forward, his eyes scanning the area. And then he saw her, Lena, crouched behind a rocky outcrop, her rifle trained on a group of Klarn soldiers advancing up the slope. She was alive, but surrounded, her back against the cliff. Adrian's heart pounded. He raised his rifle, taking aim. He had to act, and he had to act now. But before he could fire, a shadow loomed over the clearing, a third behemoth, its massive form blotting out the stars. Lena's pulse raced as she pressed herself against the jagged rocks, her breath coming in shallow, measured gasps. The Klarn soldiers were closing in, their distorted outlines flickering as they moved with deadly precision up the slope. She had to pick her targets carefully. One wrong move, and they would overwhelm her. She steadied her rifle, exhaling slowly, focusing on the nearest Ktharn. Its mandibles clicked in agitation as it searched for her, its eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. She squeezed the trigger, the bullet punching through the thin slit in its armor. The alien dropped without a sound, its body collapsing into the dirt. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Ktharn surged forward, its cloaking field shimmering as it drew a vicious-looking blade. Lena fired again, the shot catching it in the shoulder, but it didn't slow. Panic flared in her chest as she fumbled for another round. Then, a crack echoed from the rocks above, and the Ktharn's head snapped back, a neat hole drilled through its skull. Lena blinked, her mind struggling to process what had happened. She turned, her eyes searching the ridgeline, and saw a familiar figure emerge from the shadows. "Adrian!" she shouted, relief flooding her voice. Adrian nodded, his rifle still trained on the advancing Ktharn. He moved with a careful, deliberate precision, his face a mask of focus. Lena's heart lifted at the sight of him, but the elation was short-lived. There was no time to talk, no time for anything but survival. "Get to cover!" he called out, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "I'll draw their fire!" Lena hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. She sprinted towards a boulder, her muscles burning with exhaustion, and ducked behind it. Bullets and energy blasts ricocheted off the stone, sending shards flying. Adrian's shots rang out with deadly accuracy, each one dropping a Ktharn before it could close the distance. But there were too many. For every one that fell, two more took its place, their camouflaged forms blending into the rocky terrain. He could feel the weight of their numbers pressing down, a relentless tide that threatened to engulf them both. "Lena, we're outnumbered!" he shouted, his voice tight with strain. "We need to move, now!" She peeked around the edge of the boulder, her eyes scanning the chaotic battlefield. "Where to?" "We're boxed in." Adrian's mind raced, assessing their options. The behemoth still loomed at the far end of the clearing, its massive bulk casting a long shadow over the battlefield. If they could lure it into the Ktharn ranks, it might buy them the time they needed to escape. But it was a long shot, one mistake, and they'd be crushed. "We need to get that thing moving," he said, gesturing towards the behemoth. "If we can make it charge, we can use the chaos to slip past." Lena's eyes widened. "Are you insane? It'll tear us apart." "Not if we're smart about it," he replied, his voice steady. "You still have those flares?" She hesitated, then nodded, pulling a small bundle from her pack. "Yeah, but it's not much. What's your plan?" Adrian glanced at the behemoth, then back at the approaching Ktharn soldiers. "I'll draw its attention. When it starts moving, light those flares and toss them towards the densest group of Ktharn. With any luck, the beast will charge right through them." Lena's jaw tightened. "And what about you?" He gave her a tight smile. "I'll figure something out." Before she could protest, he was already moving, darting out from behind cover and sprinting towards the behemoth. Lena's heart lurched as she watched him go, her fingers clenching around the flares. She knew there was no stopping him, no convincing him to take the safer route. This was what he did, throw himself into the jaws of danger for the slightest chance of victory. Adrian reached the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on the behemoth. It was a monstrous thing, its armor plates shifting as it sensed his approach. He raised his rifle, aiming for its small, lidless eyes, and fired. The shot struck true, the behemoth letting out an ear-splitting roar that echoed through the canyon. It turned towards him, massive claws digging into the earth as it prepared to charge. Adrian's heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins. He needed to time this perfectly. Too soon, and it would crush him. Too late, and Lena wouldn't have the chance to deploy the flares. "Come on, you ugly bastard!" he muttered, taking a step back, his rifle still aimed at the creature's head. "Come and get me!" The behemoth reared up, its eyes narrowing, and then lunged forward. The ground shook beneath its weight, rocks and debris scattering as it barreled towards him. Adrian turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, every muscle straining as he pushed himself to the limit. "Now, Lena!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the thunderous roar of the behemoth's charge. Lena moved with practiced efficiency, striking the flares and tossing them in a wide arc towards the Klarn. The bright light blazed against the darkness, the sharp, acrid smoke filling the air. The Klarn soldiers hesitated, their movements faltering as the flares disrupted their cloaking fields, revealing their positions. The behemoth, blinded by rage and the sudden burst of light, veered off course, plowing straight into the center of the Klarn formation. It swung its massive claws, scattering the soldiers like leaves before a storm. Adrian skidded to a halt, his chest heaving, watching as chaos erupted around him. "Go!" he shouted, waving Lena forward. "While it's distracted." She didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted across the clearing, her legs burning with the effort, dodging the wreckage left in the behemoth's wake. Adrian followed, his rifle trained on the few Klarn who managed to escape the creature's rampage. He fired twice, dropping the nearest one, then turned and ran, the adrenaline fueling his steps. They reached the far side of the clearing, ducking into a narrow crevice that led back towards the main ravine. The sounds of battle faded slightly, the behemoth's roars still echoing in the distance. Adrian glanced back, his face slick with sweat and grime, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. Lena nodded, her breaths coming in short, ragged bursts. "Yeah. You?" He gave a grim nod. "Still breathing. Let's keep it that way." They moved quickly, the narrow path forcing them into single file. The walls pressed in around them, the air cold and heavy with the scent of earth and stone. Every step felt like a victory, every meter gained a small triumph. But Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being hunted, that something was watching them from the shadows. And then they heard it, a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the rocks around them. Adrian's blood ran cold. He glanced at Lena, her face pale in the dim light, and they both knew what it meant. Another behemoth was close. And this time, it wasn't alone. The growl reverberated through the narrow crevice, vibrating in Adrian's chest like a distant thunderclap. His muscles tensed, instinct kicking in, and he glanced at Lena, seeing his own fear mirrored in her eyes. Whatever was out there, it was big, bigger than anything they'd faced so far. He motioned for her to stay low and quiet, the silence between them thick with unspoken understanding. They moved carefully, every footstep calculated, the rocky ground crunching softly beneath their boots. The crevice twisted and turned, the walls pressing in on either side. Adrian's mind raced, cataloging their options, but each possibility seemed more hopeless than the last. The gunship support had long since moved on, and their ammunition was dangerously low. If they were cornered now, it would be the end. He led them around a bend, his senses on high alert, and froze. Ahead, the crevice widened into a small clearing, and at its center stood another behemoth, its hulking form illuminated by the faint glow of the planet's moons. But it wasn't alone. Adrian's heart sank. Surrounding the behemoth were at least a dozen Klarn soldiers, their outlines flickering as they shifted in and out of their cloaking fields. This wasn't a random patrol, it was a coordinated hunting party, and they were waiting for something. Or someone. "They know we're here," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian nodded, his gaze scanning the clearing. "They're setting a trap." He watched as the behemoth shifted its massive head, its eyes sweeping the shadows. The Klarn soldiers moved in a tight formation around it, their weapons at the ready. There was no way through them, not without drawing the entire pack's attention. But doubling back would be just as deadly. There were probably more Klarn behind them, funneling them towards this kill zone. "We have to split up," Adrian said, his voice low but firm. Lena turned to him, shock and defiance flashing across her face. "No way. We're stronger together." "Not against that," he said, nodding towards the behemoth. "If we both run, we're done. But if I can draw them off, get them to chase me." She grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "You can't do this alone, Adrian. You'll get yourself killed." He looked into her eyes, seeing the desperation there, and felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want to leave her, not after everything they'd been through. But he couldn't see another way out. If they stayed together, they would be trapped, hunted down like animals. At least this way, one of them might have a chance. "Trust me," he said softly. "I'll lead them away. You keep moving, find another path out. I'll catch up." Lena's jaw clenched, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and fear. "You better, Adrian. You better come back." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I will." Before she could say anything more, he turned and sprinted out of the crevice, straight towards the clearing. The Ktharn reacted instantly, their weapons snapping up as he emerged, a lone figure against the jagged rocks. Adrian fired a burst into the air, the noise echoing like a thunderclap, and kept running. The behemoth let out a roar, its massive form lumbering forward, but Adrian was already moving, dodging to the left and disappearing into a narrow side passage. The Ktharn soldiers hesitated for a moment, then broke formation, chasing after him in a flurry of clicks and hisses. Lena watched from the shadows, her heart hammering in her chest. Adrian's plan was working. The Ktharn were following him, leaving the clearing unguarded. But her relief was short-lived. The behemoth, too large to follow through the narrow passage, turned its attention back towards the crevice where she hid, its eyes gleaming with a cold, alien intelligence. She bit back a curse, crouching lower as the massive creature began to move, each step shaking the ground. If she stayed hidden, it would find her. If she ran, it would be over in seconds. Her mind raced, searching for a solution, but nothing came. And then, a low, familiar hum filled the air, a sound that made her heart leap. She looked up, hope flaring in her chest, and saw a dark shape swooping low over the ridge. It was a Terran dropship, its lights dimmed, moving fast and low. Reinforcements? No, it was too small for that. A lone craft, running a high-risk insertion, probably picking up survivors. She had to get its attention. Lena took a deep breath, steeling herself. She reached into her pack, pulling out a small flare. Her last one. The behemoth was closing in, its massive bulk casting a long shadow over the crevice. She struck the flare, the bright red light blazing against the darkness, and hurled it as far as she could. The flare arced through the air, landing near the behemoth's feet. The creature paused, its head turning towards the sudden light. For a heartbeat, the entire clearing seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deafening roar, the behemoth lunged forward, smashing the flare underfoot and sending a shower of sparks flying. Lena didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran, every muscle screaming in protest, the ground trembling beneath her. The dropship banked sharply, its landing lights flaring to life as it angled towards her. She could see the open ramp at the back, a figure waving frantically. "Come on, come on!" she muttered to herself, her breath burning in her lungs. The behemoth roared again, its massive form tearing through the clearing, its eyes locked on her. Lena pushed herself harder, her vision blurring at the edges, the dropship so close now she could almost reach out and touch it. The ramp lowered fully, a Marine reaching out, his voice lost in the roar of the engines. Lena felt a surge of relief as she leapt forward, his hand closing around her arm and yanking her onto the ramp. "We got her! Go, go, go!" the Marine shouted, slamming his fist against the bulkhead. The dropship lurched upward, the engine screaming as it lifted off, the ground dropping away beneath them. Lena collapsed against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion, her eyes fixed on the rapidly shrinking clearing below. But then she saw it, Adrian, sprinting out of the side passage, the Ktharn soldiers close on his heels. He was heading straight for the clearing, and the behemoth was turning back, its eyes narrowing. "Wait!" she shouted, scrambling to her feet. "We have to go back." The Marine shook his head, his expression grim. "We can't. The LZ's too hot. We'll be blown out of the sky." Lena's heart pounded, panic clawing at her throat. She watched as Adrian reached the edge of the clearing, the Ktharn closing in. He looked up, their eyes meeting for just an instant. And then the behemoth charged,